Hello, formalists, form shifters, form makers, form experimenters. I'm Grant Faulkner, a writer who loves thinking about the contours different stories can take, and I'm with Brooke Warner, my co-host, who is also formalistically curious and a student of form. And Brooke, I just keep finding it so interesting how often we encounter memoirs that are not only groundbreaking in terms of subject matter, but groundbreaking in terms of how the subject shapes the story.
Yeah, you said it, Grant. I mean, this really might just be a golden age of memoir experimentation. I am feeling like we encounter a writer at least once a month who's trying something different, and that something different is so often organic to the subject matter, by which I mean it's not contrived or nor does it seem artificially foisted on the subject. And I've been like consistently fascinated by this. It's been a multi-year movement at this point.
Definitely. And today's guest, Eleni Sikelianos, she fits, into that arc. She is a pure formalist in so many ways, and she just published the memoir, except it's unclassifiable. It's a memoir and many other things. It's called Memory Rehearsal, and it's the third book of a trilogy that spanned, more than 20 years in the making of all three books. And her first two books, the Book of John, which was about her father, and You Animal Machine, which is about her grandmother, they're both about people whose lives were, made of ruptures and chaos. And this one goes even further back to an ancestor she barely knew existed until she was 20 years old. So there's this arc in the trilogy of going deeper and deeper into the past and further from her own direct experience until she's, essentially excavating a great grandmother who lived in a completely different century.
Yeah, that is so fascinating to me. I mean, it really is some kind of blend of history and research and
Hmm.
memoir. And I'm really curious about these people who write intimately about someone that they've never met. And in this case, someone who actively obscured herself. And so Eleni's great grandmother's name was Eva Palmer. And she did have this tendency to erase her own name from things, to give credit to others, to make herself disappear. It kind of makes me wonder, like, was that just her personality or was that what was expected of women at the time? But I did find it really just a fascinating story that, Eleni, our guest today, attempts to enter. And she does this through fragments, textures, pieces, as if she's an archaeologist. And so the form the book takes is very unique because she shifts between prose and poetry and performance scripts, also archival photographs and fiction. And Grant, I mean, I just feel like we're seeing more and more of this, and I think it is largely because of how much permission and permission structure there is to do this within memoir. But as you said, it's unclassifiable in a sense. The phrase that Eleni uses is chimeric form, and so the idea is that no single genre could contain all of that these lives had to contain. And so I like that idea so much as well. And so it's like she's looking through a kaleidoscope, which makes a lot of sense to me in terms of how you might enter into a story that you yourself didn't live.
Yeah, and that phrase chimeric form, it just stopped me because I love it. And she attributes the phrase to her friend Phoebe Giannissi. I think that's how you pronounce it. But you can tell the phrase is part of, Eleni's writing DNA because it's not just a formal choice. It's almost an ethical stance. And when she talks about form, it's almost like she's not writing a manifesto, but she has strong feelings about it. She's saying that, to force this material into a conventional narrative would be a kind of violence against it. It would falsify it. And there's something in that I find really interesting as a flash fiction person or a flash memoir person, this idea that the gaps between forms are where the light gets in. And I always say that I write my stories around the gaps. And it's interesting to me because a chimera is a creature made of incompatible parts, a lion, goat, serpent, which is exactly what this book is. It doesn't resolve into a single thing. In fact, while reading this, I often ask just what is this? I started needing a category for it to kind of ground myself, but at the same time, I really respected the risks that Eleni took, and I decided early on that I was just experiencing a very different reading experience, and I admired her for thinking about the connection between form and content in such rich and interesting and experimental ways.
Yeah, it is very much I mean, it's like it's fascinating and it's interesting. It's also kind of on trend. And there was a quote that Eleni offered in a different interview. It comes from Denise Levertov that says, "Form is never more than a revelation of content." And so I really like that because most writers are not taught that. Instead we're taught that form is a container, you choose it, and then you pour your material into it. But in this case, Eleni is saying that the form has to emerge from the material itself, which I actually really like, as a process. And I remember I was remembering, that the first time we interviewed Lydia Yuknovich, she said some variation of this, that, to follow the form basically. And so I think there are a lot of writers who do allow the book to unfold to them what the form wants to be as they're going. I'm very intrigued by that. I've often said that the content knows what it wants to be, and that you,
Hmm.
the writer, follow its lead. So it's an extension of that with form. But I've also experienced in coaching a lot of writers over the years that many people just simply can't do it. That instead that form needs to be there, like I said earlier, to pour the content into. And I sort of feel like I would be that kind of writer who I would need the form first. But
Yeah.
you never know. I know that you follow form.
Yeah, I think Eleni's way of writing is very similar to the way that I write, but I didn't start that way. I really explored so many forms and read so many books about structure and craft. Um, and so I think I kind of ended up in this place that I'm very happy to be, but I can't say. Sometimes it looks easier on the outside, but it's actually harder to stitch together a book in that way. And that's because you're dealing with so much uncertainty and a lot of ambiguity, which leads actually to a lot of self doubt. So I try to let the subject matter form itself for me, but I also try to be mindful of certain narrative expectations and rules, so that I'm not writing something that is so self indulgent and personal that it loses readers. I think that's one danger, and I think that's especially true for memoir writer, where there's often this pressure to arrive at meaning, to resolve the material, to show the reader what you learned. And Eleni is explicitly sometimes resisting that, and she says something in an interview that really stopped me. She said, "Any kind of formulaic narrative or temporal movement from A to Z is a falsehood, a prison in which life cannot be kept." A prison, and that's a strong word. And she's saying that the conventional memoir arc, which is like, here's what's happened, here's what it meant to me, actually falsifies the experience it claims to represent. And you know, because life doesn't move to A to Z. And her thoughts really resonated with me in the way that James Allison's book, Meander, Spiral, Explode, Design and Pattern and Narrative. And again, I don't mean to ever put down any conventional structure or narrative structure. I think everything can work for your memoir. You just have to find the way it works for you. But Jane Allison's book is basically my favorite book about narrative structure of all time, and just one of my favorite books. And so we were so fortunate to have her on our podcast. So I always recommend her to people who are thinking about form.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's true, of course. Life moves in all directions simultaneously. It doubles back. I remember interviewing Abigail Thomas, and she's saying, like, look, we don't remember things linearly. And Eleni says that a form that pretends to be otherwise is lying, by which she means like a chronological form, I believe. I don't know that I totally agree with that statement, of course, because I think what we're invited to do with memoir is to recreate a past. And for some people, it has to be linear, because it doesn't make sense one thing without the next, right? There are stories that build, like I'm working with a writer right now who's writing a book about being a kidney donor. And it would be odd. I'm not saying that she couldn't do it, but it would feel odd to me for her to try to do it non-linearly. So I think it just says like there are fragmentary memoirs that work for certain stories. There are linear memoirs that work for certain stories. I'm very fascinated by these books, like these fragmented books, as we've been talking about for a really long time. But I wouldn't want every single narrative that I ever read to be fragmented. I'm glad that we have
Mm-hmm.
all these different kinds of
Exactly.
narratives, right? Um, but when you're writing fragment, like there's this question: how do you fill in the gaps? How do you honor them? And I think people feel a lot of freedom with the knowing that they don't necessarily have to, because a smooth narrative is invariably going to present a problem for the writer, right? Which is just like, how do I fill that in? And lots of people then get into this question of recreation. If Eleni called it lying, I don't think she means for it to be disparaging, but more to the sense that like you kind of have to fill in the gaps, right? And Grant, I know that sometimes you wanted more of a cohesive narrative in this case to understand the story better as you read it. And so that's interesting too. Sometimes a writer will just leave you dissatisfied, and sometimes that's on purpose.
Yeah, and I definitely was interrogating that reading reaction for myself, given that in some ways I'm the ideal reader for this because her aesthetic is so much in agreement with mine. But it's all a balancing act in the end. How much you leave the holes visible, or how you handle the holes, and are the holes disorienting or mysterious and suspenseful. And it makes brings out different challenges of reading that I also appreciate. And I think about this a lot as a general flash question. When I wrote The Art of Brevity, I wrote it very much with these questions in mind. And I was, as I said, I was definitely inspired by Jane's book. And I love thinking about the art of omission and what you leave out, how it can be doing as much work as what you put in. And Eleni makes a radical choice in that she decides to leave things broken. She reproduces the fragmentary quality of the archive in the form of the book itself. So the photographs sit next to the poetry, which sits next to the performance scripts, which sit next to the prose, and the reader has to do that connective work, which is one joy of reading a book like this, is that challenge. But she also talks about looms and weaving, and there's this recurring image of weaving that runs through the book, which is connected to Eva Palmer's actual practice. She was a master weaver who wove the costumes for the Delphic festivals by hand using ancient techniques, and weaving is such a different metaphor than collage or rubble, because weaving implies intentionality and pattern and the over-under of warp and weft.
And it also implies hybrid, and Eleni has a beautiful line about what the hybrid form allows, and she says that it allows the writer to let in more light, which sounds a lot like what you said earlier. Not only through shifting forms, but through the gaps between the forms. And so I think that's a beautiful metaphor that gets evoked with a lot of artists, because it is like that. It's like it lets in more light, gives writers more space. And I think that spaciousness is exactly why people are attracted to fragmentary forms or kaleidoscopic forms. Because at the end of the day, memoir does really mostly live in some kind of unsayable space, between what happened, which you're trying to capture, and then what happened means. And
Yeah.
so that's a tension.
Yeah, it really brings to the fore also just about the limits of knowing, and about the things we can never recover, and maybe making peace with that, or maybe not making peace with it exactly. More like staying in the discomfort of it. Continuing to look even when looking can only get you so far. And I want to note also that there's just this is a wild story. That's one thing that's really interesting about it, is Eva Palmer goes from being a New York socialite in 1901 to the center of a lesbian literary salon in Paris with Natalie Barney. And then she ends up marrying a Greek national hero poet and trying to revive the ancient Delphic festivals to bring about world peace. They had very lofty goals. And then ending her life in debt and essentially homeless in America. So that's quite a narrative arc of a
Wow.
life right there. Yeah.
Yeah, that really does sound like a Greek tragedy of sorts, or like an epic Greek poem. And the most interesting thing is that Eleni grew up knowing none of this, or almost none of it, which is also interesting. And so the book is about finding herself in this story, which I think memoirists are often drawn to, especially if you have a fascinating ancestor whose story that you want to enter, a family history that you don't know, were never told, you want to know about it. And so I think that's just a great reminder of all the different shapes memoir can take.
Yeah, and it's so central to what we explore at Memoir Nation, how we are created by forces we can't possibly fully know, and the ancestors who shaped us before we had language for any of it, and the histories that live in us without even our permission. Every memoir writer is in some way doing exactly what Eleni is doing, going back into the wreckage, as she calls it, and picking up the shards and trying to figure out which ones are load bearing, So I can't wait to talk to Eleni more after this incredibly short break. Welcome back, everybody. I am thrilled to introduce our guest. I think I can pronounce her name, Eleni Sikelianos. And I'm thrilled because she's got one of the best first lines of an author bio that I've ever read, and I loved her memoir. Here goes with the bio. Born into a family of tree workers, bohemians, poets, ne'er-do-wells, visionaries, and small-time sort of hustlers, Eleni Sikelianos is a poet, writer, collaborator, and master of mixing genres. How can you not be interested after reading that line? She is a student of the poets of Naropa. She's a lineage holder in the Outrider poetics family tree. Deeply engaged with ecopoetics, her work takes up urgent concerns of environmental precarity and ancestral work. She has published 10 books of poetry, most recently Your Kingdom 2023, and 3 unclassifiable hybrid works, sometimes called nonfiction, sometimes memoirs, sometimes fiction. And those 3 are the Book of John and You, Animal Machine, and then Memory Rehearsal, which we're talking about today. Welcome, Eleni.
Thank you so much, Grant and Brooke. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so interested as someone who loves thinking about the form of stories, and as I mentioned, this is the 3rd book in a trilogy. But I understand you didn't necessarily conceive of it that way from the start. So I'm curious, how did you come to understand that the Book of John, You, Animal Machine, and Memory Rehearsal, formed a trilogy, and what does that that shape mean to you now that it's complete?
Yeah. I actually did pretty much know that there would be 3 books is what I thought,
Mm.
because I knew that when I wrote in fact, actually, I was setting out to write this book when I instead wrote the book about my dad, and which was precipitated by his overdose, and so I just had to write this book, that book rather than this one. And then I always knew that I wanted to write about my mother's mother, who was a burlesque dancer by trade. And so I did always think of it as a trilogy, but actually, um, this is not quite fully announced, but I think probably it's gonna be a tetralogy. I feel like there's
Wow.
another book to write. So that part I didn't know. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and, they're not necessarily. Each one is formally, I mean, they share a lot formally, but they're also pretty different from each other as well.
I was gonna say, since Grant asked that question, what does it mean to you now that it's complete? The answer is it sounds like you know there's more. So maybe you can say more about that, because I think a lot of our memoirists are like, they know there's something more, but then why not just a next book? Or, like how do you configure them together in that way in your mind?
Yeah, that they're related, that they're
Yeah.
of a family. Yeah, I suppose because they're all taking up ancestral histories
Hmm.
or family histories, so they're linked in that way. And I think also because they do share this sort of general formal approach, which is including prose, poetry, and images. So that for me is part of what links them. And I'm thinking about lineages, in particular family lineages, so much in these books. So yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious, and it sort of leads right into the next question about this notion of the hybrid, and that you've said that a single genre would have falsified the story. And Grant and I, in our banter, were talking about the chimeric form, which is a phrase that you use. So, could you just say more about that? What did that mean to you? Walk us through the decision to do that, and just also about like how this hybridity really allowed you to do the writing that you wanted to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it was first working on the book about my dad, and because he did have a very fractured life, I didn't want to continue that fracturing. That, I came to it as a poet, but I knew that I didn't want to just keep making line breaks in this life that already felt like there was, quite a bit had been broken for him. He was homeless the last years of his life. He was a drug addict most of my life, and as I mentioned, died of an overdose. So, and there were stories I wanted to tell, and um so I knew I had to work in sentences. For me, stories don't really accrue in poems. I know for some poets they do, but not for me. And yet there's something that the poem does, that lineation does, that I felt doesn't happen in story or in sentences. So it wasn't, and I would say for me, it's not a decision. It's more that I don't have another way to do this. I also very clearly felt and still feel that the chronology that most memoirs or most fiction offers is not doesn't work for the stories I'm trying to tell. And for me, I even I feel that there's an imposed temporal signature that is not how I experience the world. So using these hybrid forms really helps me get into this multi-temporality that these stories exist in.
Yeah, speaking of multi-temporality, your title speaks to that. Rehearsal is usually for something that hasn't happened yet, but you're essentially rehearsing the past. So I'm curious, just what does it mean to rehearse memory, and what do you think these rehearsals, are preparing us for?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's interesting. Yeah, I think that the sort of collision of those two words, people are interested in that. And I haven't I think for myself, haven't completely understood everything I want to say about it. But one of the things was thinking about a lot is the way rehearsal is what, I was thinking about how MLK and Gandhi had rehearsals for their movements, for their resistance, that you rehearsed how to be nonviolent. So you were rehearsing for this utopian moment. And as you know, one of the central things that happens in this book are the plays that my great grandmother puts on, and there were a lot of rehearsals. And the dancers and actors who participated in those have said that the rehearsals changed their lives. And that was so interesting to me that it was the rehearsals, not the play itself, that they felt changed their lives. It was partly just that coming together at very specific times of day that was so important to them. And the village children around Delphi heard these rehearsals and memorized the lines from hearing the rehearsals. So I started to think about rehearsal actually as the more important act than the few. I mean, of course, utopia or peace are the things we might be working towards, but it's actually the rehearsal for those things that gets us there. So thinking about them as the site rather than just the future possibility being the site.
Thanks for that, Eleni. Your main character is your great grandmother, Eva Palmer, and in many ways, she's a figure who erased herself because she gave credit away. She obscured her own name, and then she became closeted in Greece after being openly lesbian in Paris. And so, Grant and I were wondering, what is it like to try to write intimately towards someone like that who really in her life resisted being seen?
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for that question, Brooke. She's so complicated because in so many ways she did obscure herself in the ways that you've mentioned where she, allowed other people to take credit or even offered them more credit. And 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 hid much about her private life. And yet she was also constantly performing, the fact that she would only wear these clothes that she'd woven herself that looked like ancient gowns. She would only wear sandals that she made herself. And so she's walking around New York in the 40s or even Athens in the 30s where the Greeks are dressed as people in Paris are or the villagers are dressed in their contemporarily traditional clothes. So she was performing all the time and she was very aware of performance and yet yeah, and then I think what I have come to think about is the way that there are things about your interior life that are not for the public, and then there are things that are for the public. But she also did, I know she felt hurt by how much credit Angelos, my great grandfather, took for the Delphic festivals. Even though she was offering that, she still, I think wanted recognition for what she had done. But there, and I in that suite of the naked photos of her and her lovers, Natalie Barney and Renee Vivian, that I published in the book, I still feel a little bit like I came to know after the book was at press that those were private photos that they had taken of each other. They've been published in another book. Um, and there are a lot of questions about that other book that they were published in that's out of print. So, and I do have questions myself about exposing things about her life or exposing her. Um, I think it's a little bit different because she's not alive any longer. This is something, I think anyone who's working with family material, this is always a question. What do we expose? What do we keep private? And I didn't have those questions so much about them because they're no longer alive. And yet I still do have this little lingering, question for myself. How from the dead, how does she feel about this?
Hmm. It's a fascinating question. Anytime I've done anything with my parents or ancestors, I think the same thing. Like, am I betraying them essentially or violating them? So thank you for sharing that. And one of my main moments of speaking of the photos, I was super excited to see that your book contained photos and other illustrations as well, because I love writing stories to photos, and actually just published a book that included photos and stories, and it becomes this uncategorizable thing. Like, I've noticed that some bookstores actually shelve it in the photo section, which has surprised me, but it also makes sense. And so I just want to talk with you a little bit about your use of archival photographs and drawings, because they're really powerful narrative elements. They're not just illustrations. And they're doing work in the book. They're not just decorating it. So I was curious how you thought about that relationship between the visual and the verbal, and what can a photograph do to the language, or do that language can't.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you for just understanding the way I'm using the photographs because that's really important to me. That I do think of them as moving narrative along in ways that I don't want the text to just underscore that, or I don't want them just um, adorning the text in some way. And so I am thinking about them in that way, as narrative elements. When I've used images in books of poems, I often think about them as non-languaged parts of the poem, that they're still part of the poem. So I think that maybe that can be applied here too. That's like the non-language part of the narrative. Um, there was another piece to your question, Grant. What?
Yeah, I think it was just, how you thought about that relationship between the visual and the verbal. And you said that like they're non-language. I love the way you put that. Yeah, and I guess it's like, also, what can a photograph do that language can't? I thought the same thing with my book. It was another person's photos I was writing to, but I wasn't writing about the photo per se. The photo was almost like this filmic element, this extra texture. It was a narrative element, but yeah, it was also something intuitive, I think, and many things.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And of course, there are like, Bart's theories about what photographs do and so forth, but I use it much more intuitively also. But I do think they focus our attention in a really different way. And photos are so interesting in how they both invite us in, they're very intimate, and yet they always exclude us at the same time. Um, and so even if we don't consciously think that, it's there in the sort of vibrational energy, as we're looking at the photo, and I think that was part of what was so interesting to me, um, in
I love
using
that.
them. I mean, I guess I'm thinking that about that in particular in that photo of my great-grandmother with my grandfather when he's a child, and, um, she's looking at the camera, and so it feels very intimate. And that but then you realize, "Oh, this history excludes me, actually," even as it's inviting me to consider it and look at it. So that's I think in particular with these archival photos that felt that way. Um, this intimacy and exclusion at the same time. And then, I mean, in particular with the material I was working with for this book, which is, these Delphic festivals that my great-grandparents worked on, and especially Eva worked on so many levels so hard on. There was no I don't even know how I could describe all of that without when you see a photograph, it brings everything into focus in this way. When you see the dancers and the poses that she had choreographed and the gowns that she had woven in the ancient theater, it sort of it just yeah, it's this kind of incredible evidence of what they did. That I'm sure I should not think that language can't get to that point, but it's an incredible shortcut to have those photos.
Yeah.
So
That's so
That's
yeah.
interesting. It's a
fascinating.
shortcut, but it also invites you in for something much deeper at the same time. And I think it
Yeah.
was Barth who said photographs essentially announce this was. So I think that it speaks
Yes.
to your
Yeah.
them being excluding. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. In the way that the past is excluding even, right? Yeah, I love
Hmm.
that was there.
Well, and we had a question about the Delphic Festival recreation or revival that your great grandparents did, and they were actually convinced that it would open a path to world peace, which I found really fascinating. But the marriage, of course, ends up dissolving. So Eva ends up broke and homeless, and history then, like you've said, gives more credit to Angelos, who became a celebrated poet. So I'm curious about how you sat with that particular injustice, and how that entered into your writing of this book.
The injustice of her not getting credit for the
Mhm.
festivals or not as much
Exactly.
credit. Yeah. Well, in a way, I feel like it was a one of the engines for me and how I made this book, that having her centered rather than him. He's there because I realized I could, and he's important too. Um, but yeah, I think wanting to really have her be the centerpiece, have her be the main dancer, the main person, it was a driving force. And, um, yeah, yeah, I think it's kind of shocking how much it still happens, even though there have now been quite a few scholars who've worked on Eva, notably Artemis Leondis, who wrote a fantastic intellectual biography of Eva that came out a few years ago. But for example, and I'm just going to go there. There's a selected writings of my great grandfather about the Delphic festivals that was just translated into English. It came out maybe a year ago, and Eva is not even mentioned anywhere in the book. I mean, it's one thing for him not to mention her in his speeches because we know he had that he was he was the sun god. He was in the limelight. But to have the translator in his introduction not mention Eva was just like, and not to uh, it's now known how much more she was the person who did all the work. So it's an ongoing thing, just to say that. And yeah, so it was definitely one of the driving forces in how I wrote the book.
Well, in closing, Brooke and I were talking earlier about, two things. One, this is a great era for people really experimenting in form with memoir. We see it so often in the guests we have on the show here, and but it's also very challenging, for a lot of people to let the subject of a book form its shape instead of kind of using a more conventional structure. And you're certainly, I think, when you do that, working with more uncertainty and ambiguity and perhaps even more intuition. And so I'm just curious, because so many of our writers are really attracted to this experimentation, which is wonderful. But what advice would you give a memoirist on how to find the shape of their story in the subject?
Yeah, good question. Um, I think for one thing, it's trying to listen to the form that the material already contains, or trying to somehow sort of your feeling in the dark for what form is already there. And for example, in the book about my mother's mother, the burlesque dancer, one of the main ways that I learned or knew of her legacy was her scrapbook, which was on this black paper with taped in images. And so the center of that book was a scrapbook on a
Oh,
black
cool.
background. So just thinking about what form is already there, and that's also why I wanted so many of these archival images in this book, thinking about the form of the theater, right? And then also I have these these sort of bits of play that are speaking
Yeah,
to the
I
form of
love
the
that.
theater. So yeah, thinking about what's already there in the form that suggests itself as a way to work with, and then giving yourself a lot of time to let that manifest and take shape. And I tend to go down little rabbit holes that are quite far from the center and letting some of those remain and then trimming others away. I think that's something I've learned over the 3 because I let some of those long labyrinthian, things stand, especially in the second book. So, yeah, those are 2 things I would say. You know, Michael Ondaatje, who's a, really important influence when I was first working on these books, talks about, laying out the collected works of Billy the Kid, his hybrid work, the work where he made the switch from being a poet to being a fiction writer, has both. He claims that he laid the whole manuscript out and climbed to the top of the ladder and looked down. So I always think about that too. And I lay the whole thing out several times in the process, you know, sometimes through a few rooms and play with what the sort of rhythms of what the form's doing that way.
So interesting. Maggie Smith, who was on this show, said the same thing with her memoir. And she, of course, is a poet, first a poet, and
Oh,
didn't think of herself as a memoirist. And that's how she put her memoir together. So that's interesting.
she laid it all out
She
and
laid it all out. Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
she
yeah,
didn't write it with any sense of chronology. She wrote
yeah.
vignettes, as she called them. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the thing. I think and it makes sense that Ondaatje works episodically in his fiction too, because I think when you're coming to it as a poet, that we work in these little concentrated bursts, and so it makes sense that then we're not writing chronologically. We're writing kind of like trying to go to the heat of whatever an image or a moment is, and then we have to figure out maybe not chronology, but whatever the what's a good word for that? I mean, flow would be one way to think about it, but sort of, yeah, what the overall structure can hold.
Lydia Yuknevich described it as writing to the intensities. And I always liked that as a way of piecing things together through the intensities.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the
Well, thank
show.
you both.
Great to
Thanks
have you
for your great
on.
questions.
We really appreciate it, and good luck with the rest of the tour and the next book. I'm interested about this interconnectedness and just the idea of memoir as series.
Cool.
So,
Thank you so much.
yeah.
Yeah.
So guess what, Brooke? Yet another AI story is rocking the literary world, turning it every which way. Last week, there was this big news that consumed everybody. And I think they're going to be talking about it a while because this AI story keeps evolving in interesting and challenging ways. And to start, so the beginning of it was a short story called The Serpent in the Grove by Jameer Nazir, and it was named the winner in the Caribbean category of the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, which is one of the most important international fiction prizes there is. And then almost immediately, literary sleuths smelled a rat. This is what's so interesting, is how the readers are discovering this and investigating it. And so there was this professor who studies AI, and he ran the story through an AI detection program, and the results, suggested that the story was very likely AI generated.
Yeah, it is interesting, that the people who are detecting the influence of AI in general are the reading public. It's really not judges of contests, it's not publishing houses, it's not editors, it's readers. And I mean, I'm trying to think of a story in which it wasn't readers who really uncovered this stuff. And so Nazir has denied using AI. He says that the story was inspired by childhood memories. Granta is the publisher of the winning story. They're taking the claim seriously. They're investigating. So this one is still unresolved, and we'll see what happens. But, it's like this is a familiar moment, just a different category. And also, like the same exact day, Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk, I believe is how we pronounce
Let's
that.
go with that.
She's a very famous writer, and she ignited her own firestorm when she admitted to using AI in her creative process. So what she basically said is that when writing her last novel, she asked AI, LLM what songs her characters would be listening to at a dance. The AI gave her some titles, which sounds a lot like something a writer would do if they used Google, even now, a few years ago, whenever. And people lost their minds, Grant. And this is just how triggering AI is right now for everybody.
So triggering, and I'm going to make a public confession right now to everyone. I admit that I use AI in the same way that I use Google search, which is the same way that I used to go to the library, but I don't use it to write, so I'm just going to pause here, Brooke, so internet haters can quote me on that, ruin me personally and professionally, because writers aren't supposed to go within 100 miles of AI.
Yeah.
Am I still here? I'm credible. Okay. Joking aside,
Maybe
yeah,
we'll see. You're about to be canceled.
Yeah. That backlash was just so fierce. And Tokarczuk, she quickly issued a clarification saying her remarks had been incorrectly understood and that she did not write her forthcoming novel with AI, only used it as a tool for faster preliminary research, the same way she'd use a library and archive or Google, just like I said. So there you have it.
Yeah, and the damage was done. I mean, I don't think that the controversy is really just about Tokarczuk. It's really about what this moment represents and how, like I said, triggering AI is. And I recently wrote a piece about how the whole industry, publishing, is so absolutist. It's like it's either or, there is no nuance, and that's just not representative of how people are using AI. But lots of people are very scared right now. That's another problem. We have people who are reporting that their finances have taken a hit because of generative AI. I I struggle a little bit because how do we prove that? I'm not sure that you can draw a direct line. I think there's lots and lots of reasons why books are selling less right now. That could be a future trend for us to explore. But people are afraid that AI is going to replace their entire work. So when a Nobel laureate appears to endorse these tools, of course, it's going to land differently than if a tech blogger said the exact same thing. And so it raises this line for us all, like, what is it? Should there be a bright line? There's no rules, there's no regulation. Using AI to check a historical fact is of course different from using it to generate sentences that you then cut and paste into a prize-winning story. Nobody endorses that in the literary world, but I'm worried about how the literary world has been like, again, you can't even use it at all because people need to be able to find a way to say, like, this is okay and that's not. And I just don't think we're there yet, or we are just like, we don't have any kind of like shared consensus on what it should be. And I think that's posing a new kind of problem.
Definitely. I've been scolded for using the AI transcript feature on Zoom by writers.
Which you didn't even know you were using. It's like automatic and you have to actively turn it off. Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we're obviously going to be arguing about where that line is, or discussing where that line is, hopefully not arguing so much for years. And I think that that's a good thing, especially now, because, that argument matters. We do need to at least try to find a shared language and understanding. That said, here's what we're coming back to, especially in this community, which is wonderful, that memoir is the one form, I think the foremost form at least, where the question answers itself. Because memoir isn't just made of sentences, it's made of a specific life, a specific body that carried something, a specific memory that won't let go, and a specific wound that never quite closed. And so no AI has access to that. It might produce language that a prize jury calls flawless, but it can't produce the thing that makes you, need to write in the first place. And that need and that urgency is yours alone. And that's exactly where your work lives.
Yeah, exactly. And of course that's what memoir is built on. It's why people are drawn to write it in the first place. I'm just, when I think about all this, Grant, I'm like, if you just go back 5 years, like pre-AI, no one, literally can't imagine anyone saying, oh yes, I would love to just like put my stuff into a robot and have it spit out content and then be okay with that. Like it's like we live in a parallel universe that used to not be here and now it's here, and what we're grappling with is just absolutely insane. I, for one, am obsessed with where all of this is going because I'm encountering it in my day-to-day work life, of course, because I'm working with writers and authors even who are submitting work to She Writes Press that is, all kinds of AI adjacent, and sometimes saying, I used AI to write, and we're not allowing that at this moment, so there's just a lot to unpack here. But what we mostly want on this show is for our listeners to know what's going on. That's why we do the trend. But we are advocates for your creativity, your writing. We're always going to be champions of self-expression. That is human self-expression. That is the point of Memoir Nation. When people come to write, they are writing from their hearts. And we thank you for listening. We hope that you'll go to memoirnation.com and sign up for a membership so that we can help you and welcome you and invite you to write alongside us. We have free and paid levels. So thank you for popping over there to check it out. And as always, we'll see you next week here on the show.